Hey, ass butt.
Sherlock Holmes, put your trousers on.
Hello, hello, hello. As you may or may not know, my name is Caitlin, and this is I Post What I Want, where every week or so I post what I want. And this week, what I want to post is Superwholock and using obsession as an identity. In 2013, I was unfortunately 15 years old, which is not a great age to be in any time, but I will argue that it's harder than ever in the age of social media. In some ways it's nice because you're not limited to the scope of your high school or your town in order to find people with similar interests to yours, but you are exposed to far greater expectations than previous generations. I was born in 1998, so depending on who you ask, I'm either a millennial or a Gen Z, but the difference between generations isn't what's important here. What's important is that my childhood was very different than people who were born, let's say, pre-1995. Yeah, I played outside and spent time away from screens, but I've also experienced my entire life on the internet. I got my first Facebook account at the age of 11, and I still have that same account. People can easily scroll back to 2009 on my Facebook and see what my 11-year-old self had to say. And trust me, it's embarrassing. A personal favorite status update of mine from 2009 is this one. It just says, you. Like, was that a threat? Was it an identification? Was I responding to something? God, 2009 was a wild time for me. I was really part of the first generation that cyberbullying was a major concern. There wasn't any escape from people that you didn't like at school because they would just be there on social media, outside of classes, and being the ages of 12 to 18 is already just fucking confusing. You're trying to figure out who you are and earn independence from your parents, and assuming you're not asexual, you're also experiencing sexual attraction for the first time. And that can be very scary, especially if you're not straight. And that's why it was so special to have an online community that you could interact with and relate to. And I'm not saying that fandom is a bad thing in this video. In fact, I'm still active in several fandoms, but the Superwholock, it was kind of a beast all its own. And by the end of being involved in that fandom, it felt more like a chore than something that was for fun. It dominated my life. And you basically had to walk on eggshells because it was so hive-minded, which isn't really unexpected from a fandom that was dominated by children. And nowhere was the adolescence of the Superwholock fandom more evident than in January of 2014. Oh, remember 2014? It was a much simpler time, when Justin Bieber had just been caught with the devil's lettuce. No, wait, it was cocaine, wasn't it? Jared Padalecki, by the way, never trust anybody named Jared. They're all assholes, like, across the board. I've never met a Jared who wasn't an asshole. But that's really not the point of this video. Jared Padalecki tweeted something about Bieber paying his friend to take the fall for cocaine. I kind of remember it very vaguely. Anyways, the Beliebers decided to boycott Supernatural, and the Superwholock fandom banded together and watched that weekly episode of Supernatural, which was probably disappointing. It actually had the highest viewership that the show had had in 3 years, and Supernatural was instantly revived for a 10th season. It has now recently been renewed for season 14, which is 14 seasons too many. Out of the 3 shows, I was the most involved with Supernatural. It was my favorite. I basically lived, ate, and breathed Supernatural for like 3 years. I first got into watching Sherlock, and then I started watching Supernatural after the Mish-apocalypse, which we should probably talk about. No, actually no, I don't think I'm ready for that. I never really got into Doctor Who, but Superwholock felt kind of like a package deal. Like I had to be obsessed with all 3 of them to be part of the community. So I actually did watch all of the series. I've seen everything up to the end of Matt Smith as the Doctor. So I do actually know a fair amount of Doctor Who. I watched up to series 3 of Sherlock. I didn't watch the newest one because I didn't care. And I watched up to season 11 of Supernatural. I'm not really sure, to be honest. But I did watch season when I was in first year to catch up because I still felt attached to the characters. And looking back on the shows, they're, how do I put this gently? They're not good. They think that they're better than they are, and that they have super clever writing and funny jokes, and they just don't. We are living in what has been called the golden age of television, and there are some amazing shows out there that put these three to shame. And they did have good moments. The way Sherlock filmed thought is still one of the most compelling ways that it's been represented on screen. Supernatural did have a fantastic concept and some very entertaining episodes, but it was arguably much stronger in seasons 1 through 5 when each episode was a separate entity that kind of connected into a greater arch, rather than have an arch dominate the show. And, before they kind of ran out of ideas because it was supposed to get cancelled after season 5. Doctor Who still has some episodes that I would consider some of the greatest television in history, like Vincent and the Doctor from season 5. But this isn't enough to make up for how disappointing the majority of the shows were. These shows remind me of some feedback that I have from one of my professors. Quite frankly, this was lazy. Thank you, Professor. That didn't take a blow to my confidence whatsoever. You could see the passion of the creative team leaking out of the writing, acting, and production the longer that the series went on. But they've been dragged on because at one point they did dominate team culture in a way that I can only connect to one event in history. And that's Beatlemania. Beatlemania began in 1963, shortly before the single I Wanna Hold Your Hand entered US charts. It was the first collection of what would come to be considered mass female hysteria, or as we call them today, fangirls. The crowds of screaming teenage girls actually got so bad that the band had to stop touring in 1966, just 3 years after their fame grew to staggering heights. It's a really interesting question of why the Beatles? Around the same time, there were other prominent boy band groups, like the Beach Boys, the Four Seasons, and the Rolling Stones, just to name a few. So one wonders what it was that made the Beatles at the front of this movement. In a 1992 collection titled The Adoring Audience, Fan Culture and Popular Media, Barbara Ehrenriech, Elizabeth Hess, and Gloria Jacobs attempted to answer this question in their essay, Beatlemania, Girls Just Want to Have Fun. Together they argued that teenage girls in the 1960s flocked towards the Beatles as sex icons because their form of masculinity and their presentation of sexuality was less threatening to girls who had never been exposed to sex before. And in a sexually repressed society, they used the Beatles as an outlet to explore their burgeoning sexual awareness. And I know you're probably wondering why I'm including how sexy the Beatles were in a video about Superwholock, but hold on, I'm getting there. See, the majority of Superwholock fans were young girls, like myself, who for the first time were experiencing their sexuality. And to project their sexuality onto something relatively harmless and unattainable like the Winchester brothers was a safe way for them to explore these emotions and feelings. And these were projected onto men who, with the exclusion of Supernatural, projected masculinity in a more subdued way. The Doctor wore bow ties and danced around the TARDIS, and that kind of masculinity isn't outright threatening to teenage girls. You could do a whole other video on masculinity in Superwholock and how it does perpetuate a patriarchal view of male intelligence and superiority. Now, I haven't watched any of the last two Doctors, so Jodie Whittaker taking on the role of the Doctor may have changed that. But I don't hold much hope for a show that was dominated by Stephen Moffat and lives in the legacy of him as showrunner. But back to experiencing sexuality. It's finally time to talk about shipping. The Superwholock fandom, or really more appropriately, it was infamous for how into shipping their fans were. I'm assuming everybody knows what shipping is, but just in case, shipping is where you want to see two characters end up together in a relationship, or you want to have the show continue a relationship that they've introduced. Shipping wars became quite common, and these fandoms had pairings that were extremely popular. The most notable being John and Sherlock from Sherlock, and Dean and Castiel from Supernatural. Wincest, which was the ship name for the Winchester brothers, was also relatively popular, but that's incest. And incest is wrong. I was really into Dean and Cass's relationship, and I was in the majority that believed that it was actually going to end up canon on the show. Oh, how sweet and naive I was. But this was before I understood the concept of queerbaiting and even realized that I was a queer to be baited. That being said, I do owe a fair bit to the fanfiction that was written around the Dean and Cass relationship. Without it, I don't know if I would have been comfortable with queerness in general. Shipping for me was a way to begin experiencing and understanding my own same-sex attraction in a way that was fairly removed from myself. And believe me, there is a lot of fanfiction available for Dean and Cass. Maybe fandoms and Superwholock became a jumping off point for teenage girls to experience queerness in a way that wouldn't feel real to them. And let's not call fangirls delusional, because these shows, especially Supernatural, purposely wrote in queer subtext and then called the fans crazy for seeing it. I actually went back and rewatched several episodes, and the underlying romance that I remember does still exist, even after I took off the rose-tinted glasses that I originally watched Supernatural with.
Not like Cash lives in my ass. The dude's busy. Cash, get out of my ass.
I was never in your...
Rewatching the shows that I loved so dearly and encompassed almost the entirety of my personality made me realize why they did. I was able to project parts of my identity that I wasn't yet able to accept onto these TV shows that seemed like they were so much more than they are. And maybe that's because I wanted myself to be so much more than I was. But I've moved on, and I don't need these shows as a security blanket anymore. Media for teens needs to be more conscious than ever of what they are teaching them, and what stories they're tantalizing them with. Queerbaiting isn't something that people will just sit back and take anymore. Yes, we're still starved for LGBT content, but we're not starved enough that we can justify believing that a show like Supernatural will ever give that to us. So, Superwholock as a whole doesn't really exist anymore, unless you're digging far into the depths of Tumblr, which, that's a dark place. Don't go there. And that's because the fans realized that they deserved something better. They deserved to be treated better, and they deserved media that actually cared about their viewers. And maybe along the lines, we also learned that obsession isn't a substitute for a personality, and we were ready to let go of these shows in order to grow as people. So when it comes to the future of teenage media and the inevitable new object of teenage obsession, I think Sam Winchester put it best.
We got work to do.
If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, the whole YouTube shebang. And if you have any suggestions for things that I should do in the future, comment them down below. And if I want to, maybe I'll post it. My stack of books is very precocious. Precocious isn't the right word. Precarious. I know the English language.